Good evening, everyone. Hi. Wow, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Greg Bays. I am the curator of public programs here at the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, also known as MOCAD. Welcome to the latest in our Detroit Speaks series. We are hosting a talk with Wayne State University professor Dora Apel about her latest book, Beautiful, Terrible Ruins. I want to thank my colleagues Ian Clark, Augusta Morrison, Maya Davis, and our interns Sam and Izzy for helping make these events possible. They help make things run very smoothly. And as I mentioned before, this is the latest talk in our Detroit Speaks series. Detroit Speaks began in September of 2014 as a series of lectures exploring the significance of Detroit's art schools, art education, museums, institutions, galleries, and artist-run spaces. The talks will continue and will be conducted by a wide range of speakers, including artists, academics, curators, and educators, most of whom are based in Detroit. Dora Apel is a professor and the W. Hawkins Ferry Endowed Chair in Modern and Contemporary Art History in the Art and Art History Department at Wayne State University. She teaches courses on modern and contemporary art, photography, and visual culture. She's the author of 5 books, the latest of which was just published by Rutgers University. Beautiful, Terrible Ruins, subtitled Detroit and the Anxiety of Decline, is an important addition to the literature regarding Detroit in the present era. I'd venture to say that more than any other source, Beautiful, Terrible Ruins organizes the causes of Detroit's current state with accuracy and without hyperbole. I also have to say that as we have spread the word about tonight's event, the reaction was unanimous. Smiles broadened as our Facebook guest list expanded. Dora's colleagues and students were all excited to hear that this event was happening. It's a pleasure to see you all here. Please join me in welcoming Dora Apel to MOCAD.
Thank you all. I want to thank MOCAD and Greg Bays and all of you for coming tonight. So I want to start with why I wrote this book. What was the question I started with? Well, I had a lot of questions, but ultimately it came down to what is the cultural and political work that ruin images do? Why are so many people drawn to the city of Detroit? Why are there thousands of photos of Detroit? What is the appeal of ruin imagery, the appeal of ruination itself? What was behind the ruin porn debate? Why has ruination become a global obsession? And why has Detroit become the quintessential example of ruination? So I started with these questions. And I want to start here tonight, this talk, with what I think is the nature of the appeal. So by highlighting urban abandonment and decay, ruin imagery brings into focus widespread economic decline. We see the effects of corporate disinvestment and the decline of the former thriving manufacturing centers as income inequality continues and ecological crises continue to grow. In short, ruin imagery represents this sense of a downward spiral and underscores the inability of the capitalist state to protect its citizens and its cities in a world where the majority of people now live in cities. The decrepitude of cities like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit feeds a pervasive cultural pessimism that foresees violent disintegration and collapse, whether through viral pandemics, ecological destruction, or deindustrialization and economic decline. Hence the paradoxical appeal of ruin imagery, as faith in progress and a better future erodes. The beauty of decay and ruin imagery helps us to cope with the terror of apocalyptic decline. Ruin imagery is necessarily in dialogue with the aesthetic of the romantic sublime, which depended on the idea of mentally mastering the terrifying in nature. One can only do this through representation, which offers the safety of distance and time and allows the viewer to take pleasure in this mental mastery. In other words, we master the fear of disintegration through the aestheticized pleasure afforded by the beauty of decay in ruin imagery. And we experience this at a safe remove. This pleasure in mastering the anxiety of decline through representation is what constitutes what I'm calling the deindustrial sublime. So, contemporary ruin imagery constitutes a new deindustrial sublime that serves to contain and control the terrifying forces of capitalist disinvestment, privatization, and wealth inequality. The experience of the deindustrial sublime, which occurs when contemplating ruins and ruin imagery, becomes a way of both evoking and taming our fears. As most of you know, the proliferation of ruin imagery has activated a debate over what is known as ruin porn. And this debate raises the question of whether or not such photos should be dismissed as exploitative and trivializing, or whether they make visible what might otherwise remain hidden from history. Detroit-based photographer Jim Griffin, who is credited with coining the term ruin porn, explains his resentment this way, and I'm quoting, "I take pictures of ruins too, but I put them in the context of living in the city. These photographers were showing up with $40,000 cameras to take pictures of houses worth less than their hotel bills." After years of shooting the city, that was the end of the quote, it's difficult for local photographers to see others arrive from the outside with better equipment and connections to the art world and walk off with credit for revealing the blight of the city. But history is rife with scenes of ruin and decay that draw outside photographers and reporters. The problem with ruin porn as a tool of cultural analysis is that it would invalidate a great many images of disaster and do away with a sizable chunk of pictorial history. So picturing the abject may always carry a whiff of exploitation, but I believe those pictures do act as witnesses to history. Like all witnesses, they are subjective and imperfect, but they offer perspectives that might otherwise be unseen and unheard. Moreover, people are irresistibly drawn to the ruins, and you can't stop them from coming and photographing. So both insiders and outsiders are drawn to the same scenes of ruination, take the pictures of the same sites, although they may convey different moods, as we see here in these two images. Griffin's photo portrays a stifling and musty darkness set against the bright sunshine beyond the windows. And this is mitigated only by the slender box elder sapling that has taken root in a carpet of rotting books. In Moore's photo, the books have turned mostly to mulch, while young trees reach through the open roof toward the sky. The receding diagonal perspective and warm light creates a sense of renewal in adversity, a kind of comforting perspective, while Griffin's photo generates greater tension between the promise of regeneration and the bleakness of decay. So we might conclude that the ruin porn debate is really not a debate about subject matter so much as an issue of insiders versus outsiders, and an insistence that insiders retain a kind of ownership of the ruins. But all ruin photographers are drawn by the aesthetics of decay, and the story is always larger than the local. The problems of Detroit are the problems of declining American cities from Maine to California, not to mention deindustrialized cities in Europe and beyond. For many poor local residents, Detroit ruin imagery in the national media becomes a source of demoralization and embarrassment, regardless of who has taken the picture, which suggests that the larger fear, fueled by this proliferation of ruin imagery, is that of an irreversible marginalization and alienation of the city from a host nation that views the ruins of Detroit from a position of aestheticized fascination at a comfortable remove. Whether the images have been produced by insiders or outsiders, national viewers make no distinction. And insiders, moreover, they simply can't retain ownership of the ruins. The ruins of Detroit, I would argue, like those of Baltimore or St. Louis, are America's ruins. Yet many ruins are actually invisible to society at large because they are not memorialized in any way and because there's no consensus about what caused them. Unlike, say, the World Trade Towers, Detroit's ruins were not caused by an act of war or some other spectacular event, but are instead the result of more gradual and hidden processes of disinvestment, emigration, and racialized discrimination. Their general invisibility is compounded by the fact that they tend to be located in poor and minority neighborhoods. In Ice House, Detroit, Greg Holm and Matthew Raydoon encased an entire abandoned house in ice during the winter of 2009-2010 by pouring gallons and gallons of water over it and letting it freeze and building it up in layers. The work simultaneously conveys a sense of collapsed or suspended time and continuous dissolution in the gradually dissolving form of an ice house. The light emanating from a home in the background makes the hermetically sealed ice house appear all the more chilling, evoking frozen assets, hell frozen over, and a long winter of discontent. The sense of a future that is already past suggests the shrinking possibilities in the lives of those whose hopes and dreams have been lost to the endless rounds of privatization and austerity that are the foundation of capitalist neoliberalism since the 1970s. The project was meant to draw attention to the mortgage foreclosure crisis, which disproportionately hit Black, Latino, and Asian residents, as well as the elderly who live on fixed incomes. Ice House Detroit evokes the terror of homelessness and economic collapse, while containing and subduing that terror through the pleasure of the deindustrial sublime. Scott Hawkins' photo also evokes the deindustrial sublime by pleasurably aestheticizing an abandoned home at night. Like many ruined photographers, Hawking contemplates the tension between nature and culture as a kind of timeless struggle and inevitable cycle. Yet it can be argued that ruination is not inevitable, but man-made. And the effects of ruination are especially stark in Detroit. The unemployment rate last year was the highest of the 50 largest cities in the nation, and more than 3 times the national average, while the higher education rate was well below it. Though city services are slow and inadequate, property taxes are high, continually threatening poor residents with home foreclosures and threatening the city with yet more blighted, abandoned homes. Nearly 40% of the city's population lives below the poverty line. About 1/5 of the city's residents can't afford a car. And Detroit has one of the worst public transport systems of any major city in the nation, which, moreover, is not integrated with a regional public transit system so that people can get to work in the suburbs. Indeed, there is no regional integration of most resources, so that what is now the poorest city in the nation, which is overwhelmingly Black, is bordered on the north by some of the wealthiest suburbs in the nation, which are overwhelmingly white. This suggests that any strategy for solving Detroit's problems will require the integration of city resources with the affluent surrounding suburbs in a form of regional reorganization and centralized planning that would serve the needs of everyone. And this would include a massive jobs program, regional public transportation, access to health care and city services and education, and renewal of the city's infrastructure. But what about gentrification of Midtown and downtown, the 7.2-mile strip? Will this be what saves and renews the city? While the pensions and health care of some 31,000 current and retired city workers were cut as part of the grand bargain during Detroit's bankruptcy proceedings, hundreds of millions in public funds were made available to fund business ventures of a handful of corporate billionaires. Led by Dan Gilbert of Quicken Loans, the largest online mortgage company in the country, and Mike Ilitch, owner of the Detroit Red Wings hockey team and the Tigers baseball team, they are developing a Midtown downtown entertainment district that is centered around a new arena for the Red Wings, funded by $285 million in Michigan tax dollars. To make way for this, they are removing low-income residents, including seniors and the disabled, from their rent-subsidized apartments. Several residential buildings in the downtown area are being bought up by companies connected to Ilitch and Gilbert, and the tenants, many of whom have lived there for decades, have already been given eviction notices. The plans are to gentrify the area by converting the formerly low-rent buildings into upscale housing with market-rate rents. And this will be lovely for the mostly young, middle-class white professionals who live in the area, but it will do nothing to reverse the economic decline of the other 95% of the city. The reasons for Detroit's pivotal position are rooted in its relationship to modernity. As the birthplace of the automobile and Fordism, the industrialized and standardized form of mass production, which became the basis of modern industry, Detroit was seen as the motor force of modernity in the 20th century. The city greatly expanded in the 1920s when the downtown skyscrapers were built, but manufacturing disinvestment began in the immediate post-World War II period and developed into a cascade of closing auto factories in the latter half of the 20th century up to the present. The resulting ruination has come to signify modernity itself in ruins. So it's not an accident that the imagery of abandonment and decay produced by deindustrialization in Detroit has become a global metaphor for the current state of capitalist culture. As the largest ruin in the nation, the Packard plant has become iconic and was even featured in the Jim Jarmusch film, Only Lovers Left Alive, which was partly set in Detroit as the best place in the city to dump corpses. Such imagery resounds with a challenge to the capitalist state to support its cities and their populations. It challenges the idea of progress and rationality in the capitalist order itself. The story of abandonment is told not only through shuttered factories, but also through the thousands of ordinary vacant homes that are mostly modest wooden structures. Many of these houses are easily juxtaposed to Detroit's downtown, such as the old GM headquarters, the GM headquarters in the Renaissance Center, as you see in this image, or the bright orange houses of Object Orange, on the other hand, a creative intervention that appeared along the city's major freeways in 2006, which were meant to make these decrepit houses visible to middle-class commuters who were rushing home from the city to the northern white suburbs. The effects of industrial disinvestment last for decades, especially in cities where one industry has dominated, by destabilizing whole communities through the loss of jobs, homes, and health care. Reductions in the tax base in turn lead to cuts in public services, crime increases, as does suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, family violence, and depression. Deunionized workers who find new jobs often do so at far lower wages, contributing to an almost inescapable cycle of continuing decline. When pay and benefits negotiated by unions go up, it raises the standard of living for all workers. But deindustrialization and deunionization have had the reverse effect. As unionized industries close, wages and benefits fall across the board for all workers. Thus, one of the social costs of deindustrialization is the declining economic security of the entire American middle and working classes. Even workers who were never displaced by plant closings or industry decline are affected. Deindustrialization, therefore, not only harms the communities and the workers whose jobs have been eliminated, but undermines the quality of the jobs that remain and therefore the quality of life. In Detroit, there has even been an ongoing crisis over water. Repeatedly construed in the national media as a post-apocalyptic landscape, Detroit is often compared to war zones, hurricane wreckage, conditions of the poorest developing nations, the aftermath of nuclear explosion, or destruction by alien invaders. But photographs, by their nature, tend to explain very little about the complex causes of decline or the ramifications of ruination for the city's future or the nation's. Instead, the city, as produced through images, takes on different meanings in different contexts. Thus, we have two national narratives about the causes of decline in Detroit. On one hand, Detroit is seen as exemplifying the normal boom and bust cycle of capitalism. In this narrative, it simply embodies inevitable economic trends, and therefore no one is to blame. In the second narrative, Detroit is seen as a failing black city, and therefore construed as a racialized city that has caused its own decline through incompetent or corrupt leadership. This means that Detroit is seen as both representative of urban decline and as a uniquely mismanaged city. It's seen as demonstrating either the historical inevitability of decline or demonstrating its own history of irresponsibility. And in this way, the rest of the country may be lulled into believing that Detroit's downward spiral is either deserved or unavoidable, or a combination of the two. And these constructions of the city allow the real agents of decline, the corporations and the state, to evade responsibility and to justify the state takeover of Detroit, its forced bankruptcy, the attack on workers' pensions, the privatization of city services, and other threatened austerities. And these actions ultimately serve as disciplinary warnings to declining cities and towns across the nation. By placing the burden of debt on poor, Black, and working people in the face of a shrinking economy and under cover of blaming no one or blaming the city itself, Detroit and its representations assume a pivotal role in helping to shape the future of city life in America. In the cultural imagination, the idea of Detroit has come to serve as the repository for the urban nightmare of decline in a world where the majority of people live in cities. And thus we have the paradoxical appeal of ruin imagery. The beauty of ruins helps us to cope with the terror of decline as faith erodes in a future that promises to exclude the many and privilege the few. Put another way, the hold of apocalyptic fear on the cultural imagination is produced by the widespread anxiety of decline and the search for ways to mitigate its effects. This also explains the huge popularity of the many zombie and disaster films, which are premised on post-apocalyptic scenarios, and television shows like The Walking Dead and Fear of the Walking Dead, which are among the most watched in television history. The zombie has come to represent a figure that is stateless and rightless, the disempowered migrant, the refugee, the worker for whom there is no work, the chronically unemployed or underemployed. So the zombie represents a loss of autonomy and has become a central figure in our culture as the downwardly mobile sink further into dark visions of the future. And this helps explain the popularity of zombie races and chases and walks, events that take place across the country every year, including in Detroit, as you see here, where World Zombie Day has taken place annually since 2007. And just as the ongoing crisis of poverty extends well beyond the United States to encompass the globe, zombie walks, races, and chases now take place throughout the world, in cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Singapore, Brisbane, Nottingham, Dublin, and Santiago. So a standard trope of ruin imagery is the suggestion of a timeless struggle between nature and culture. Andrew Moore's photos tend to emphasize this relationship with nature in the ascendancy, as in House on Walden Street. The greenery creates a living, breathing, if windowless facade, as if the home were deliberately subsuming itself for some new creative use, while the blue garage door and the blue painted curb echo the sky to invoke a tropical idyll. Griffin's image on the right is a more ominous lament, suggesting ashes and fire, and a landscape regressing to a dark past. So the question for me to bring that back is, what are the political repercussions of representing nature and the architecture of decay as the primary ruin image? Because most ruin imagery is nature and architecture. The metaphor of nature reclaiming the city, whether used in negative or redemptive terms, neutralizes or obscures the actual processes that have a destructive impact on a city, such as the racism, anti-unionism, and industrial restructuring that are the critical factors in Detroit. And this is important for understanding why the most well-known ruin imagery of Detroit contains a notable absence of people, and why many observers often don't realize that there are still almost 700,000 residents in the city. The pervasive narrative that Detroit is a poor black city that only has itself to blame for its problems raises the suspicion that the overwhelming invisibility of the city's residents in most ruin photography is not accidental. If the victims of the city's decline disappear, it makes the discourse about architecture and landscape, structuring it in terms of the inevitable reclamation of the city by nature, whether suggesting a return to a pre-civilized state or a new ecological idyll, and presenting a landscape that is empty and regressing to the past or waiting for new creative uses displaces the discourse about people and the effects of abandonment and decay on their lives. To claim that the deindustrialization of Detroit is part of a timeless struggle between nature and culture ignores the real and specific political and economic factors leading to the city's decline, which are far from natural. Photography that focuses only on the beauty of decay thus offers a narrative that distances and obscures the ongoing crisis of poverty and unemployment. And yet, at the same time, such imagery visually intensifies the realities of economic and cultural deterioration. By making these devastating effects starkly visible in carefully composed portraits of decay, they induce a variety of affects, including an implicit criticism of the status quo. The aesthetics of decay serve as a warning of decline, even as the images participate, wittingly or not, in constructing the dominant narrative of Detroit. In these two works by the French team of Marchand and Meffre, they write that the images suggest the effects of a nuclear catastrophe. In the room at the Lee Plaza Hotel on the left, amid the peeling paint, the falling cabinet, the disintegrating chairs, the small television and jars in the middle of a kitchen table, facing what was likely once the most comfortable seat in the apartment, suggests the last frugal repast of a circumscribed existence. Once a luxury hotel, the Lee Plaza served as a subsidized assisted living facility for low-income senior citizens for almost 30 years until 1997. So the nuclear catastrophe for them was the prosaic event of city budget cuts. On the right, the St. Mary Margaret School, built next to St. Margaret Mary Church, closed in 1970 as the East Side neighborhood, hit hard by the loss of factories and jobs, transitioned from white Catholic to Black Protestant. The invisibility of the Black populace reflects and reinforces their invisibility to the corporations and the policymakers that are the real agents of decline, those who help create the patterns of ghettoized, racialized poverty that have long obtained in the city, while simultaneously washing their hands of that responsibility. Sociologist Camilo Jose Vergara has been among the most systematic photographers of Detroit, returning to the city over the course of decades to rephotograph sites and document transformations over time, as he does here with a building on the corner of Woodward and 6 Mile. Vergara was criticized in the mid-1990s, however, for his proposal to preserve Detroit's abandoned 1920s-era skyscrapers. Vergara hoped to preserve the buildings designed by nationally known architects such as Daniel Burnham, George Post, Albert Kahn, and McKim, Mead, and White from the wrecking ball. He also felt they possessed an Athenian splendor redolent of a lost civilization. But his suggestion that a skyscraper park in downtown Detroit that would stabilize the buildings as an American acropolis and a memorial to a disappearing civilization evoked a firestorm of controversy by seeming to give up hope for revitalization and renewal. Julia Taubman, who also published a book of Detroit ruin images, goes even further in suggesting that the forces of entropy should not be impeded. In an interview with Vogue magazine, Taubman said, "If the book is about anything, it's about these buildings as monuments. No one should tear these buildings down, but no one should rehabilitate them either." Perhaps the difference between 15 years of continuing decline is the difference between outrage and acquiescence. Or perhaps the anger at outsiders is driven by a sense of powerlessness, which in turn evokes feelings of anger and resentment, not against the conditions of the city directly, but against the pictures that convey them and seem to make those conditions worse simply by publicizing them, making the city seem alien and pathetic, and perhaps worst of all, provoking pity as a depersonalized response to distant suffering, akin to seeing pictures of starving children in Africa. Marchand and Meffre refer to Detroit as that contemporary Pompeii, with all the archetypal buildings of an American city in a state of mummification. For them, the city is no less dead than the ancient city buried under the ash of Mount Vesuvius. This view is confirmed by their photographs, which are taken in dark, overcast light conditions, making them feel cold as well as devoid of people. Marchand and Meffre articulate the deindustrial sublime by offering a poignant and mournful testament to decline while commemorating the city's picturesque aesthetic. Overall, Marchand and Meffre and Andrew Moore offer seemingly opposite yet parallel approaches. Marchand and Meffre's somber photographs, cool and drained of life, suggest a lamentation for a state of irreversible decline and mortal rigor, while Moore's photographs, warm and vibrant with color, offer a commemorative tribute to the beauty of decay and the resurgence of nature. But I would argue that these are flip sides of the same aesthetic strategy, which are also used by many other ruin photographers. One view laments city decline as a deindustrialized wasteland, yet finds beauty in decay. The other engages in romanticized reveries on the struggle between nature and culture, while also finding beauty in decay. Zen and the Art of Garbage Hunting and the Protectors of the Refuse, a series of 7 black and white photographs by Mitch Cope, evokes disrupted lives by documenting the piles of rubbish that litter the neighborhood bordering Hamtramck and Banglatown where Cope lives. The images transform the refuse by the addition of totems that loom over the chaotic heaps of broken furniture and the debris of emptied homes. These are fantastical apparitions that hover above the wreckage like protective spirits or guardians of memory. Some of the garbage piles were put out for bulk pickup day, but they were left uncollected by the city due to a blizzard, growing larger as they waited for the next bulk pickup 3 months later. The last free pickup before the city garbage services were privatized. Brooklyn-based Detroit native Sandra Ossip also addresses effects of urban economic decline. On a return visit to Detroit, Ossip was shocked to find her neighborhood and childhood home razed and surrounded by empty lots strewn with garbage. She was equally appalled to learn that at least a dozen bodies had been found in the previous 12 months in this neglected part of the city on Detroit's east side. Using photographs of burned out houses surrounding her former high school and places she had lived, her 6-foot sculpture, Beautiful Homes and Gardens, from the series Broken Dreams, evokes the destruction of whole neighborhoods. Like Cope's work, it signals a ruined present while resonant with the echoes of lived experience, a present destroyed by the continuing processes of neoliberal disinvestment and racialized discrimination. Chicago-based Detroit native Dave Giordano photographs people and often includes text, making visible and legible the effects of poverty and disenfranchisement. This caption, for example, says, "Charles has been squatting in this abandoned house for the last 6 months. The crane company he worked for went out of business after they lost all of their automotive contracts to foreign competition. Recently divorced and unable to find work, and his unemployment benefits depleted. He's trying to fix up this abandoned house by salvaging materials from other abandoned buildings. His home was recently ransacked by thieves that broke in and stole what little valuables he had." So these images are from Giordano's brand new book, Detroit Unbroken Down, which came out after my book was published. Giordano's father was employed at the Packard plant as a sheet metal worker, and Giordano's method here is to represent those who have been struggling for years in a harsh environment. He attempts to have his subjects reveal themselves and their stories, in part because he felt no one else was doing it. So I'm going to end by showing you several more of his works. Giordano was inspired by the work of Moore and Marchand and Meffra to want to put a human face on the city. In this case, he came across a woman passed out on the street. Giordano called 911, and a few minutes later, an ambulance arrived and took her away. She was completely unconscious. He doesn't know why. Giordano's approach is quite simple. He drives around town until he sees something that interests him and gets out of his car and investigates. It often leads to meeting someone who is curious about him and wonders what he's doing, and often these encounters lead to lasting friendships. Sometimes he worries about being gullible or foolish, but he claims never to have had a bad experience from the hundreds of people he's encountered during 32 visits to the city over the past 5 years. He believes it's necessary to push himself beyond his comfort zone. This image captures the pathos and the humor. This is "Stay the fuck out, please." Giordano writes that after purchasing this house through the Detroit Land Bank Authority for $3,000, Chantrell was having trouble keeping squatters out while she worked to fix it up. She posted the sign in the window to make a blunt statement, but was gracious enough to be polite. This is a particularly beautiful roadside memorial. This is a rather grim one. This is from the 1970s when Giordano started taking photographs of Detroit. I'm showing you just one example of two gay libbers. This is Charlie with his custom bike. And Giordano writes, "Every car Charlie has ever owned has been stolen." So he bought himself a bike and then personalized it to celebrate his theft-free life. So to conclude, ruin images can lament, they can elegize, they can celebrate the ruins, they can implicitly critique the forces or effects of decline. They can embrace those effects as beautiful or haunting or melancholic, but they can't disguise the halt in progress that ruins represent. And this halt in progress evokes the anxieties of an eroding faith in a better future that drives the proliferation of ruin imagery. So the appetite for ruin imagery grows larger as the fears of ruination, which drive the need to contain and control those fears, grow more intense, imbuing ruin imagery with ever greater cultural power. Thus, the fascination with Detroit's urban ruins intensified as the city negotiated the crisis of bankruptcy. Despite the narrative that seeks to marginalize and isolate the city as responsible for its own decline, Detroit has become emblematic of failing cities everywhere. Yet just as ruin imagery challenges the logic of the capitalist system as a source of progress and rationality, it also challenges us to consider how our declining cities may be reclaimed and reimagined. It invites us to consider forms of economic reorganization and democratic planning as part of the forging of an egalitarian society based on need and not profit, where cities meet the needs of their collective populations, provide the basis for individual fulfillment, and help sustain the Earth's environment. Thank you very much.